This is the Listening Tube.
Hello, thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley. On this episode, we'll hear about the existence of the soul, and I'll speak with a man about America's ethical archetype. But first,
Not the headlines.
every year at this time, an international event happens that draws people from all over the world to a small town in Pennsylvania. If you're not a sports fan, you probably don't know and don't care. But this isn't about sports. It's about diplomacy at a level many don't appreciate or even know exists. It's the Little League Baseball World Series. Teams from around the world earn the right to travel to Williamsport, Pennsylvania to compete against the best Little Leaguers that can be assembled from cities around the United States and around the world. Many of the participating teams aren't even decided until days before, maybe a week at most. Then the frenzy of planning begins. The teams from Australia and Japan and places more afar are given a little more time to arrange things. But the teams from the United States usually have to get to Williamsport a little more quickly. And there are many of them. American teams come from places like Washington State, Texas, California, Florida, and even Hawaii, not to mention those who are closer, from places like New York, Connecticut, and even Pennsylvania, the host state. The international teams come from places like Italy, Poland, Russia. Not every year, but those are just some of the places that have sent Little Leaguers to Williamsport to play baseball against the best the rest of the world has to offer. This year, the aforementioned Australia and Japan are in, as well as Taiwan, Canada, Aruba, Cuba, the Czech Republic, Venezuela, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. And yes, I do realize that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States, but Little League puts them in the international bracket, same as Guam. Among those foreign lands are a few that may be a bit surprising. For example, Cuba. The United States government has a trade ban with Cuba, but Little League Baseball found a way to allow Cuba to send a team. The United States government isn't friendly at all to Venezuela's government or its dictator. In fact, our country says their country's recent election was a sham and Leader Maduro should recognize the will of the people there. But Venezuela often represents that region by sending a team to play in the Little League World Series. The team that I refer to as Taiwan is officially known as Chinese Taipei at the Little League World Series. If you follow world events, you'll know that there is a lot of friction between China and Taiwan, especially since China thinks Taiwan is part of China, and the people of Taiwan and its government do not. Calling the team Taiwan would recognize it as an independent country, which the U.S. government does, but not Little League Baseball. Little League Baseball did call Taiwan Taiwan before 1980, but has since changed the name to Chinese Taipei, as well as all the records going back before 1980. And Taiwan was often the World Series champs, having won it 17 times in just over 30 appearances. But if you watch the games on television or listen on the radio or read about them in the newspaper, you'll often see Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei. But the International Olympic Committee and the World Baseball Classic refer to the Taiwan team as Chinese Taipei simply for diplomatic reasons. Little League Baseball does the same thing for the same reason. All of that is behind-the-scenes diplomacy. There's another, more obvious diplomacy going on. It's between the players, both on and off the field. I don't know anything about how they group or separate the players in the dormitories at the Little League complex, but there are common areas, I'm sure. The cafeteria, hallways, recreation rooms, and outdoor spaces are all opportunities for mostly boys and some girls to get to know each other. Every game ends with the opposing teams shaking hands. Someday, these kids are going to grow up and remember the good time they had in South Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and all the cool kids they met from around the world. Those memories will influence how they look at the world and people from other countries. Perhaps the greatest influence will be that they don't look at people from other places with suspicion. Even if they did before, now they know better. Being a part of the Little League World Series gives these kids a perspective most of us never get. And they've already shown us that they can perform under pressure, know the value of teamwork, have a level of intelligence at least equal to their level of physical ability, and have leadership qualities. Their coaches thought enough of them to guide them to the promised land of baseball. If there is ever world peace, it will not have started in Washington, D.C., It will not have sprung from Jerusalem or Qatar. A future without war won't originate with a decree from Moscow or Beijing. I believe that future historians will someday be able to trace world peace to a friendship that was made, a handshake that was given and received, or a game of ping pong played in the rec room at the Little League World Series in South Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, a different kind of war is being waged at the crossroads of America. Any history buff will tell you that the best places to be throughout the development of civilization were always the trade routes. That's where the money was. That's where opportunity lay. Turns out, little has changed since the beginning of time. Indianapolis isn't called the crossroads of America for nothing. No less than 5 interstate highways pass through or directly around it. Not surprising, a lot of cargo passes through what many of us at Fort Benjamin Harrison used to call the cornfield with lights back in the 1980s. Today, the merchants of Indianapolis are a different breed, not visionaries or business tycoons. This isn't Constantinople. This is Indianapolis, where law enforcement confiscates millions of dollars a year from FedEx packages that are just passing through from other states. You may be familiar with forfeiture laws. They vary from state to state, but basically give law enforcement permission to confiscate cash and property used in the commission of a crime, or suspected of being used in the commission of a crime. These forfeiture laws were originally meant to be a deterrent to crime in the hope that criminals wouldn't want to risk the losses. But what they've turned into is a legal way for police to keep your stuff. You would think that they need to somehow justify keeping your stuff, but in many cases, they don't. That's exactly what's happening in Indianapolis. We can't blame the city of Indianapolis, though. It's the county of Marion and the prosecutor's office. It and the state of Indiana are now the target of a lawsuit over the practice. So, what triggered the lawsuit? A jewelry dealer in California was waiting for a cash payment from a client in Virginia. The cash was sent via FedEx, and its route took it through Indianapolis. The cash was seized by law enforcement. Law enforcement claimed the cash was a violation of a criminal statute, and therefore subject to confiscation. Which statute was violated was never stated. $42,000 was intercepted in Indianapolis with no evidence of any laws being broken, and no request for assistance from either of the 2 states involved in the transaction that I could find. The law firm of the Institute for Justice is fighting civil asset forfeiture laws in multiple states and filed a countersuit on behalf of the jewelry store owners. And yes, I said countersuit because the county in Indiana filed a lawsuit to keep the money in the first place. It seems to be a common practice. A story by C.J. Claramella for Reason says the Institute for Justice claims the Marion County Prosecutor's Office has claimed over $2.5 million from over 130 packages at the FedEx facility there over the last 2 years. None of it had anything to do with the county or the state of Indiana. All of the packages were going from a state other than Indiana to another state other than Indiana. The story quotes a lawyer for the Institute for Justice as saying, "This scheme is one of the most predatory we have seen, and it's past time to put a stop to it. It's illegal and unconstitutional for Indiana to forfeit in-transit money whose only connection to Indiana is the happenstance of FedEx's shipping practices." In the case of the jewelry store money, the Marion County prosecutor's complaint claimed that, and I quote, "seized currency was furnished or was intended to be furnished in exchange for a violation of a criminal statute, or is traceable as proceeds of a violation of a criminal statute, in violation of Indiana law as provided in IC 34-24-1-1. The problem is the way the forfeiture laws are written. They leave a lot of wiggle room for greedy counties, cities, or police departments. Cash and property can be confiscated even if it's just suspected of being used in criminal activity. There doesn't have to be a charge, arrest, or conviction for a crime. In other words, if Floyd Mayweather and I were headed out for a night on the town, and he wanted to bring $100,000 cash with us in case we end up at a strip club and he wants to make it rain, which would never happen because I don't frequent strip clubs, and we get pulled over for a burned-out taillight on his Bentley, the police could take all that cash because they suspected we were about to commit a crime. Oh, and they could also take the Bentley. Just because me and Floyd wanted to show our appreciation of beautiful women. And neither one of us has the Lyft app on our phone. With 99,000 packages an hour going through the Indianapolis FedEx hub, it's the second busiest in the nation. It seems that under the notion of all those packages can't be legal, the Indianapolis Police Department can justify going on a fishing expedition, looking for packages that look like they might be suspect. Maybe they suspect a crime, but they seem also to be suspecting a wad of cash. When they do find cash, the reports are filled out as vaguely as possible as to why the package was flagged in the first place, or they just make stuff up. It doesn't matter because all they need is suspicion in order to open the package and keep its contents. But the fight is on to end these practices. The Institute for Justice lists reasons why civil asset forfeiture laws violate the 4th, 8th, 10th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. Among the arguments are that law enforcement failed to duly notify the owners of the property in the cases at the FedEx facility, as well as the county not having jurisdiction to confiscate property coming from and going to other states. Their countersuit in Indianapolis, if successful, will render the policies unconstitutional.
Let's go back through the listening tube for This Week in History.
This week in 1926, Professor Charles Henri of Sorbonne near Paris, France, confirms the existence of the soul through radiation readings. Interestingly, the only references I could find of this event were a couple of New York Times articles that were behind a paywall. Other than that, there were no mentions of Professor Henri and the soul anywhere, even on Wikipedia. That might lead someone to believe that it's all poppycock, and it may be. You'll never convince the faithful that there's no such thing as a soul. But science has pretty much abandoned the search for proof of the soul, and instead settled for what psychology today calls the old physico-chemical paradigm of life. We're all just atoms and particles, and the only part of us that comes close to being a soul is our thoughts. As a result, science sees brain activity research as the true window to discovering the soul. It was the same year, 1926, that Nobel laureate Max Born demonstrated the different behaviors of particles when they are and are not observed, and how the knowledge of the experimenter can determine the behavior as well. Those results suggest that a part of our minds, which some interpret as the soul, does exist. Not only that, but the soul exists in an unobserved state somewhere outside space and time. Perhaps radiation readings don't prove the existence of the soul, as Professor Henri's experiment showed. But our current understanding of the mind suggests a very real possibility that the soul does exist, even if it can't be observed.
The listening tube will return at the speed of sound. Contact the listening tube by calling 570-601-1101 or email thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
My guest this week is the author of a book about ethics and morals in society and government. It's called America's Ethical Archetype, and in it, Damien Terence DuBose digs deep into the individual psyche and explains how each of us can improve the world in which we live. Now, when you say archetype, do you mean in the Jungian sense?
I do. I used Jung's framework to make a psychological assessment. And I'm using an interdisciplinary approach with philosophy and psychology to a specific philosophical system and a specific psychological system.
I'm going to look that up.
He's gonna look it up. He's really gonna do it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
According to Wikipedia, Jungian archetypes are a concept from psychology that refers to a universal, inherited idea, pattern of thought, or image that is present in the collective unconscious of all human beings. The psychic counterpart of instinct, archetypes are thought to be the basis of many of the common themes and symbols that appear in stories, myths, and dreams across different cultures and societies. The concept of the collective unconscious was first proposed by Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst.
I think using Jung's framework helps me to identify the psychological characteristics that we would need from a leader specific to America.
Okay, so then what is America's ethical archetype?
So I think that if we look at if we take a look at history, and this is part of what Jung's work is just make it simple. Where we are today is it's like I wouldn't say a culmination, it is an evolution from when we started. And so coming from our primitive beginnings, the way he speaks about it is that we come from a collective beginning. The idea of an individual is a fairly recent idea in the history of the world. And so I think my approach in my book was just to get a real clear understanding of how much of recent development that is, and understand that that's just something we arrived at that point. And so I wanted to basically identify what is an individual, because the way he speaks of individual is a psychological individual, somebody who owns their own judgment, who is conscious of their decision making, rational person. And so therefore I just wanted to harp on that point, just to understand, okay, what is an individual, and if we're having a country for individuals, what would that consist of psychologically? So that's those are the characteristics that I drill in on: judgment and rationality.
So it's a contrast between the individual and the collective.
Yes. So yeah, because the way his system works, it does have both elements. Because we live in societies, we have to basically balance both, always, unless living on a desert island, which I guess this conversation wouldn't be that relevant. But yes, that's exactly what it is, a balance between both.
Do you have a problem with individuality? Is it the basis of all of our ills? How does that work?
So I don't have a problem with individuality. I think what the base assumption is, when I look at America, the base assumption is that we are all striving for individuality. And what I feel like I've uncovered in the book is that that's something that not everyone accepts, implicitly or explicitly. Individuality and an escape from a collectivism or collective roots. And so I just wanted to dig in deeper and to figure out, well, what if we are if America is a country built for individuals, we would need leaders who exhibit these traits or relate to these traits or understand these traits. And so that's kind of where my America's ethical archetype piece comes in. It looks at leadership and what are the proper psychological traits for a leader for America if we're striving for this recent level of development, psychological recent level of development in human societies, and an escape from a collective, or sometimes what Jung would say, a primitive view of societies.
Now, certainly different types of governing lend themselves more to collectivism or individualism, and correct, it would appear that the American type of governing lends itself more to individualism.
Correct. That's correct. And so that kind of leads me into, I'm trying to examine the dysfunction that we see currently in our society. And what I think that I can boil it down to is we don't really have a good understanding of what the identity of America is. And so just like you said, there are different societies that have different aims, different goals, but those goals are philosophically incompatible. Like collectivism versus individualism, there's no way to mix those two philosophically. And so if we don't have that fundamental understanding of what we're doing here in America, I don't understand how we can lead properly. It's just going to be a push and pull between collectivist to individualist, collectivist to individualist.
Now, you call tradition, religion, and intuition tactics. I don't think most people would think of those things as tactics, so why do you see them in such a way?
I think because of the way that I'm looking at rationality, and in the book, I do go through the development of these skills. I mean, I'm thinking that throughout history, these were tools that we leveraged to get us to another point, to get us to a higher point. But I think we've developed more modern tools. Just for example, the scientific method, for example, philosophical inquiry, that we developed on top of those basic human tools. And I think a lot of times, because those are basic fundamental human tools, I think a lot of people just count on those things. They just rely on those, and they don't actually think about our newer tools, and they just go from instinct and instinct and intuition and emotions and things like that. So I just think that we need to use our newer tools in addition with our basic tools and propel us forward into a new level of elevation, I guess I would say.
And that's why you consider them to be outdated?
Uh, Tradition has its place. I don't think that it's outdated. I think we rely on it too much. That's my answer on it. I don't think that we should use tradition as a means of knowledge. It's not. It's a tool to help us retain knowledge. It's a tool to help us, have not have to think about everything every day, every single decision we have to make. It helps us to simplify life in a sense, but that is not justification for doing what we have been doing just because we've been doing it.
No, I totally agree with you, and here's why. I joined the Air Force back in the early 80s when the Air Force was not even, I think it was about 35 years old at the time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And as you may know, the Air Force separated from the Army in 1947. Now, when they did so, the Air Force scrapped all kinds of Army traditions. And
Right.
they had been saving them up for over 200 years.
Right.
And so suddenly now the Air Force has wiped the slate clean and they started their own traditions and have far fewer. Now, some of those traditions were fun, but
Right.
most of them were just ceremonial. And I agree with what you're saying there. And I think that Air Force philosophy of jettisoning those traditions brought a lot of relief to a lot of the people who were in what was the Army Air Corps before it became the Air Force. So, yeah, I can see how getting rid of traditions, especially if they don't tend to accomplish anything,
Exactly. That's the point.
can be beneficial to us. Now, as for religion, doesn't it help people through inspiration and words of wisdom? I mean, faith can be a very powerful thing, and after all, aren't religions really just philosophies?
I mean, for your last question, I would assume that they were philosophies, or I do take that position. They are belief systems, implicit philosophies in a sense. But I, this is where we get to the point where I think those strategies or techniques or tactics are outdated. And the problem is that I grew up in a religious, I grew up, we had a religious upbringing. There are a lot of things that I learned from that upbringing, a lot of good things that I think that I hold on to. What the problem is that if I accept those ideas without critically evaluating them, then I don't really have knowledge. I'm just obedient. I'm just, following a path without conscious awareness. And I think when your teaching methods are rooted in that type of mystical teaching, it doesn't help to wake you out of what Jung would call the unconsciousness. It's an identity with the object. Now, different types of objects, but the word, what people would call the word, or what these ideas, these mystical beliefs that get passed down through generations, those can be seen as objects, and people are just taking those on faith, like, oh, this is how things work. This is how we're supposed to do things, and we'll continue to do these things without critical evaluation. So that's what I'm against, not critically evaluating things from a rational reality standpoint.
How does intuition get grouped in with tradition and religion? To me, while religion and tradition often go hand in hand, intuition seems to work independently of those other two.
So I guess that probably comes from the Jungian psychological framework. So in Jung's for psychological framework, you have four basic cognitive functions. Two of them are what he calls irrational, sensation and intuition, and two of them are what he calls rational functions, thinking and feeling. And so the idea of sensation and intuition, the way he explains it, is more two sides of the same coin of perception. It's just basic perception, and sensation is more of a conscious perception. Intuition is an unconscious perception. So I think the problem with intuition in and of itself, it's more of the issue of intuition being the sole or primary means to knowledge, or someone's accepted primary means to knowledge. Intuition is not a tool for knowledge. It's more of a tool for exploration. You need a means to evaluate hypothesis. You need to evaluate that hypothesis. And so when I speak about intuition, I'm just saying that let's not use intuition as if it's a means to knowledge. Let's use it and go back and check it.
Trusting your gut doesn't have a basis in research and factual analysis.
No, not the factual analysis. It could take you in the right direction. It could definitely send you in the right direction, but we just have to evaluate it.
If you're lucky, it will send you in the right
Yeah,
direction.
exactly.
A lot of us trust our gut and it turns into a big mistake. But
True.
and I guess that's why intuition cannot always be trusted. Now, I notice you speak a lot about ethics, but also about morality. How do you separate the two? To you, what is the difference in definition between ethics and morality?
So this may not be something that most people agree on, but the way that I look at ethics and morality, ethics is specifically between individuals. It's good and bad, and the way I look at it is a understanding of good and bad or right and wrong. There can be an internal understanding of that, and there can be the interpersonal understanding of that. And so when I think about ethics, I think about the interpersonal understanding of right and wrong. And I also think that there's an area for morality that is independent to you, to the individual, where, this is what I believe is right or wrong. And if other people may believe something else, I may disagree. And that to me is the individual use of morality. You could be talking about facts in one way, and I could be talking about facts in another. And based upon our implicit principle, we could both be accurate, but also be saying different things because we're judging by different criteria. That's part of the work, is that I think specifically America has a specific foundation, fundamental principle, and it needs to be approached from that standpoint. And that necessarily excludes other approaches to ethics in this country. That's my position.
Your book seeks changes in both government and education. We know many of our schools, especially inner city schools, are failing our students. They're being graduated into adulthood without being prepared for it. I just heard recently only 17% of Chicago school students are proficient in math. Are ethics and morality the answer there too?
I think so. And the reason why I say this is that when you have a good baseline, it affects everything we do as a unit, as a country, as a nation. When you evaluate these ideas from a specific ethical foundation, then you can come to consistent conclusions. It's just like a mission statement with a business. It's more of we have to make decisions. Is the decision that we're making in line with our fundamental mission statement, our fundamental principle? If we ever lost out here, how do we judge the decision that we're making? We always just refer to this mission statement, to this fundamental principle. What are we doing here? And that takes us to ground zero, and that allows us to have a guideline for the decisions that we are making. And I think that that's the problem. And those guidelines are missing. So what we do in education, what we do in government, we have to have a fundamental ethical guideline, an explicit understanding of that, and that will guide our decisions, because we won't be working counter to each other all of the time.
And whose responsibility is it to create those guidelines?
So leaders, and that's kind of a vague answer, but that's the conclusion that I come to, because leaders lead, and it's not really a responsibility. It's the way that I position it in the book is I speak out, not necessarily because I want to be a leader, not because I want people to follow me. It's more of a sense of a preemptive self-defense in a way. If we don't develop and promote good ideas, it's our fault if we're left with evil or bad. It's our fault. because we have to promote the good.
So the leaders would also be, and again, I'm going to use the word, but for lack of a better term, responsible for not only creating the ethics, but also getting a majority of the people to agree with those ethics, because not everybody has the same ethics.
This is true. I mean, but I think if we look through the history of time, I don't know that we had to have consensus on everything across the board. I think for me, one of the very, I guess, beautiful, for lack of a better word, things about America is that we don't have to agree on everything to get along. I disagree with friends of mine all the time, but we still have a fundamental understanding, connection with each other, regardless of if we agree on everything. And I think that that's a good thing. It means we have opinions, you know, and and we're thinking. So the thing that I fight for is, let's make decisions from this fundamental standpoint. Let's make the decisions with individuals in mind. Let's make the decisions with actual people, not people in the future, not somewhere else that I don't know. Actual people who are actually living, who have actual circumstances, and make decisions from that standpoint. To me, if we can clear that up, that had that fundamental grounding, I think that it would help a lot in our decision making in all of those areas: education, government decisions, politics, everything. So that's my goal.
Did we ever have that basic understanding as a country before? Have we strayed from it and need to get back to it, or have we just never found it?
So I believe we did have that assumption before. I think the country was founded on that assumption. I think, and this is the reason why I felt the need to bring Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism, into the book, is because what she does is explicitly state the premises that were implicit in the country's founding. I would like to aid in the push to explicitly state what was implicit before, because as long as it stays implicit, it's hard for us to defend those principles. What she just explained is logic, the logical conclusion of these actions. It's not surprising to me that we are what we are, because I think we just don't have an identity, and we don't push to have an identity. We want to be inclusive of everything and everyone. And doesn't that make us feel good to, be accepting of communism and individualism and socialism, all of these different things? And some of these things are antithetical to the fundamental principles of America. They just are. You just have to state that.
One thing that you are striving for in your book and in your personal life, I guess, is a national dialogue. A national dialogue would be helpful in bringing your ideas to light. How can other people get that conversation started?
Identify your values and don't do anything except for pursue the things that you value. If everybody were to take that one simple step, I think that would be a giant step for what you just explained. And when I say values, consciously selecting things, foster or develop your relationships, develop your decision making, your choosing your career, the things that you want to pursue, all of the things that are important to you. Consciously evaluate those things and pursue those things. And I think that would clear up a lot of the issues that we have today.
So somehow it all circles back again to individualism, doesn't it?
Yes, always. That's the book. That's pretty much the book. It does. It does a robust examination of individualism and shows why these things are right, why individualism is the proper method of ethics. Why is it so important to the history of the world? Why has it been so successful? Why do we experience, experience troubles when we leave those principles, when we don't, pursue those principles anymore? And that's what it comes down, because those are fundamental questions. it's pretty much the first two questions is to live or not. And then the second question is for myself or for others.
I like what you said just prior to that, because my motto is it's a lot easier to stay out of trouble than it is to get out of trouble. So I think if we examine what we're going to do or how we're going to do it, we can avoid perhaps an uncomfortable situation down the line.
We need that. We need that. And I don't think we've had enough of that. We're not getting enough of that in politics. I don't believe so. I don't think politics it's not a long view look at life. It's very short term.
If there's something I didn't ask you about, what would you just like listeners to know?
I think the part that most people gravitate towards is the last part. It's a complete journey. It gives you the fundamental principles of what my kind of more of a axioms that we start with, and it starts to develop that story. But when I get to the end, it goes into application. And I think for a lot of people, that's going to be the section that pops out. I've heard that it's just more of what steps can you take to pursue independence? How can you identify your values? And I just give some pointers on how to identify your values, what steps to take to pursue your values. If you are communicating with people with different communication styles, how do you bridge these gaps? So those are kind of those tidbits and things that or steps, tactics that I give people. And those are the things that I've heard a lot of feedback on.
So if we each work on our own individualism, and if enough of us have the same ethics, then the strength of our individualism will improve the strength of our collective. Will it
Absolutely.
not?
Absolutely. Yes, the core principle for me is, and I guess Rand would call it rational egoism, which is pretty much tied intrinsically to individualism. You take care of what you can take care of. Everything that's of value in your life, you have a natural incentive to address these things. Your attention is drawn to those things. And if you take care of what you can take care of, I do the same where I am. Collectively, we have a stronger fabric. I think a lot of people think that when you look outwardly, that's more of a caring, ethical, moral standpoint. No, it's not. It's not. And that's counterintuitive for a lot of people. And that's kind of what I wanted to take people through in the journey in the book. That's what I want to take people through is, no, what you're doing is you're projecting your inner self outward and you're escaping your own agency, judgment, responsibility when you do that.
Are we ignoring taking care of our own needs more now because it seems like the government is taking care of more of our needs than ever before?
I think part of that is true. Yes, I think that's true. The issue with that is that when we're raising children in a society that we have, they have never had to develop that muscle. They never had to develop the muscle to do for themselves. For some, it's not for all. For some, they just never had to develop that. And work ethic is a development. It's not something that we're not born with. It's not biological. You just don't pop out of the womb like, oh, I want to work hard. This is something that we've developed over time. That's what I mean about this evolution over time. Hard work is an idea that we've developed. If people could just, be born and eat all their life and never have to work, why would you ever develop a work ethic? Why would you ever have to think about, right and wrong and all of these things? So that's what I mean about that long trail of history, understanding history, the developments that we have, and understanding that if we stop teaching the youth, it's not their fault that they haven't developed to a place where they can have personal agency. We never brought them up to that level. We didn't leverage history and our knowledge to bring them up to that level.
Damien's book, America's Ethical Archetype, is a much deeper dive into the subject. What are your thoughts on individualism and collectivism? How are your elected representatives demonstrating ethics or morality? Are they consistent with your ideals? Send your thoughts to the Listening Tube at outlook.com.
I wanna know what you're thinking.
The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2024. Thank you for putting your ear to The Listening Tube. Subscribe today or text me from the homepage. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou Ad Infinitum.